The final metallic click of the lock echoed in the hollow space that was once Ilara's home. It was a sound of absolute finality, colder and sharper than the autumn wind whipping around the corner of the Oakhaven street. She felt the eviction notice, a flimsy piece of paper in her trembling hand, its bureaucratic words a death sentence to the life she had known. Her heart hammered a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. Before her, on the cracked pavement, sat their entire world. 2 battered suitcases, one held together by a fraying rope, and her heavy-duty sewing machine, its cold steel body a monument to a skill that was now useless. Her son, 16-year-old Leo, stood beside her, his shoulders slumped, his jaw tight as he stared at nothing. Inside Ilara's worn purse, $87 in crumpled bills and loose change represented the sum total of their existence. The number burned in her mind. $87 between them and the street. A wave of nausea rose in her throat. Ilara's stomach ached with a hunger that was more than just a lack of food. It was a hollowness that consumed her from the inside out. Her husband's death, a supposed construction accident just 3 months prior, had been the first blow. The discovery of his secret, crushing debts, was the second. It felt like a betrayal that echoed from beyond the grave, leaving her not only a widow but a pariah. She could feel the damp chill of the evening seeping through her thin coat, a physical manifestation of the despair that had settled deep in her bones. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of Leo, she had to be strong, but the strength felt like a costume, brittle and easily broken. Every breath was a struggle, each gust of wind a reminder of their exposure, their utter vulnerability. She ran a hand over the cool, silent metal of her sewing machine. It was a cruel irony. The tool meant to stitch things together was now just a heavy burden, weighing them down. Leo kicked at a loose stone on the sidewalk, the small, sharp sound cutting through the oppressive quiet. He hadn't spoken more than a few words since the landlord had forced them out. His silence was heavier than any accusation. Ilara could see him trying to be a man, trying to shoulder a weight no 16-year-old should have to bear, and the sight of it ripped her heart to shreds. She felt like a failure. The forgotten town of Oakhaven offered no comfort. Windows on the street were like vacant eyes, staring past them. The distant wail of a train horn only emphasized their isolation, a sound of a world moving on, leaving them behind. They were ghosts haunting a life that was no longer theirs. Invisible to the few people who hurried past, their collars pulled up against the cold and against the sight of Jejish misery. The air smelled of damp leaves and indifference. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Ilara's spine. The memory of the accident would surface without warning. A series of violent, sensory flashes. The acrid smell of concrete dust. The high-pitched, metallic screech that still echoed in her nightmares. The unnervingly calm voice of the foreman on the phone, his words rehearsed and hollow. "A tragic accident," he had said. The phrase felt like a lie, a thin sheet of plastic stretched over a chasm of unanswered questions. But the grief, followed so swiftly by the shame of the debt collectors, had left no room for suspicion. It was easier, safer to believe the lie. Now, standing on this cold street corner, the doubt resurfaced, a small insistent itch in the back of her mind. Her husband hadn't been a reckless man. He had been quiet, meticulous. The idea that he would have been so careless felt wrong, just as wrong as the secret mountain of debt he had hidden from her. The two facts didn't stitch together. They were loose, fraying threads of a story she couldn't yet see. As the bruised purple of the twilight sky deepened into an inky, starless black, a primal fear began to take hold. The temperature was dropping. The wind grew teeth. Where would they go? A park bench, the cold stone steps of a church. The reality of a night spent in the open air was a physical threat, a monster lurking in the encroaching darkness. Ilara clutched her purse, the $87 inside feeling less like a safety net and more like a countdown. It was the price of a few hot meals and maybe one night in a grimy motel, and then nothing. The absolute zero of the streets. She looked at Leo, his face pale and strained in the dying light, and the last vestiges of her composure crumbled. A silent tear finally escaped, tracing a cold path down her cheek. Hope was not just a luxury she couldn't afford. It was a language she had completely forgotten. Her world had shrunk to this single, terrifying moment on a cold sidewalk. The municipal clerk's office was the last stop on a tour of humiliation. Ilara had spent the morning navigating a maze of sterile corridors that smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner and quiet desperation. The sounds of her worn shoes squeaking on the linoleum, a constant reminder of her intrusion. She felt the weight of unseen eyes on her, the quiet judgment of a world she no longer belonged to. Each door she opened offered the same clipped, impersonal refusal. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum on the street, had settled into a low, painful throb of resignation. But when a secretary, taking pity on her pale face and Leo's thunderous silence, mentioned a file connected to her husband's name in the archives, a tiny, treacherous spark of hope ignited in the darkness. It was a fool's hope, she knew, but it was all she had left. She clutched the scrap of paper with the room number on it, her knuckles white. It felt like a lottery ticket and a final judgment all in one. The air grew thick with the smell of old paper and dust as she approached the final door. The clerk, a man whose nameplate identified him as Mr. Abernathy, didn't look up when they entered. He was a creature of the archives, pale and hunched, surrounded by teetering stacks of yellowed folders. A single fluorescent light hummed and flickered overhead, casting a sickly, buzzing pallor over the room. The air was so still, she could hear the faint whisper of dust motes settling on a century of forgotten paperwork. Ilara cleared her throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Mr. Abernathy finally raised his eyes, peering at her over a pair of thick spectacles. His gaze was devoid of curiosity or pity. It was the look of a man cataloguing an object. "Yes," he asked, his voice dry and raspy, like crumbling parchment. Ilara felt her insides twist with anxiety. She explained her situation in a low, halting voice, the words tasting like shame in her mouth. She felt Leo shift his weight beside her, a small, restless movement that broadcast his own burning humiliation. Her own voice sounded foreign, a beggar's plea. Mr. Abernathy listened with an expression of profound boredom, tapping a long, bony finger on a leather-bound ledger. After she finished, he was silent for a full minute. The only sound the incessant hum of the light fixture. Then, without a word, he shuffled over to a massive metal filing cabinet, the drawer screeching in protest as he pulled it open. He returned with a single, brittle folder. He licked his thumb, the wet sound making Ilara flinch, and began leafing through the papers. "Thomas Coleman," he muttered, reading her husband's name. "Maintenance. Yes." He pulled out a single sheet of paper, its edges brown with age. "It seems," he said, his voice flat, "that your husband, by virtue of his municipal employment, retained an arcane custodian's right of residence to the Oakhaven public clock tower." He spoke the words as if they were a strange and inconvenient bit of trivia. Ilara just stared, the words not making any sense. A clock tower. The phrase hung in the dead air of the office, utterly bizarre. A hysterical laugh almost bubbled up from Ilara's throat, but she choked it down. A clock tower. It was absurd, a joke. But the clerk's face was impassive. He pushed the document across the desk. It was an old municipal charter, the text dense with archaic legal jargon. But there it was, in faded ink. The custodian of the clock mechanism was granted lodging within the structure. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, wild rhythm of disbelief and dawning, terrifying hope. A roof, a place to go. It didn't matter what it was. It was shelter. "Is this legal? Can we stay there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The clerk shrugged, a gesture of complete indifference. "The right has never been contested or claimed in over 40 years. The property is condemned, of course. No utilities. But the city cannot legally remove you. Condemned, no utilities." The words barely registered. All Ilara heard was a reprieve from the street. A wave of lightheadedness washed over her as she took the pen he offered and signed. The scratch of the nib was the sound of a lifeline. The journey to the tower was an ascent into another world. They left the modest, grid-like streets of Oakhaven Center and began to climb the winding road that led up the hills ringing the town. The sewing machine was a dead weight, its metallic body digging into their sore muscles with every step. Ilara's arms burned, and Leo's face was grim, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the air. The neat houses with their manicured lawns gave way to properties with overgrown weeds and peeling paint, and then to empty lots where nature was reclaiming the land. The sounds of the town, the distant traffic, the barking dogs, faded away, replaced by the rustle of the wind in the skeletal branches of the trees. The air grew colder, smelling of pine and damp earth. With every upward step, Ilara felt her fragile hope warring with a growing sense of unease. This was the forgotten edge of a forgotten town. What kind of place would be waiting for them here, at the very top of the world? And then they saw it. The clock tower did not rise gracefully from the hilltop. It clawed its way into the sky. It was a skeletal Gothic ruin, a shard of black stone and rotting timber against the bruised grey canvas of the clouds. It was far taller and more decrepit than she could have ever imagined. One side was covered in a creeping black mold that looked like a disease, and several of the high, arched windows were just gaping, empty sockets. The great clock faces were blank and white, their hands frozen at 2:45. It looked less like a building and more like a headstone for a giant. A low, mournful whistle of wind echoed from its belfry, a sound of profound loneliness. Ilara stopped dead in the road, the handle of the suitcase slipping from her numb fingers. The hope that had carried her up the hill shattered instantly, replaced by a cold, heavy dread that settled in the pit of her stomach. Leo let out a quiet, bitter laugh beside her. "Home, sweet home," he muttered. They walked the final 100 yards in silence, the path dissolving into a track of cracked asphalt and weeds. The crunch of their shoes on gravel and broken twigs was the only sound. As they drew closer, the smell hit them. It was a complex, layered stench of decay. The primary note was damp, rotting wood and wet stone, but underneath was the pungent, musty odor of mildew and the sharp, acidic reek of bird droppings. It was the smell of a place that had been left to die, a scent of total and absolute neglect. Ilara felt nausea rise in her throat again, acrid and hot. Her breath caught in her chest. This was not a sanctuary. This was a place of ruin. She looked at the massive, iron-strapped wooden door, its surface blistered and grey. A thick, rusty chain was looped around the handles, but it wasn't locked. It was just hanging there, an empty gesture of security. She felt her stomach tighten into a painful knot of disappointment that was so intense it felt like a physical blow. This was a mistake. A terrible, cruel mistake. Ilara reached out a trembling hand and pushed against the immense door. The sound it made was a deep, groaning shriek of tortured metal, a sound of protest that echoed up into the tower's hollow interior. The door moved only a few inches, scraping against the stone floor, and a cloud of thick, grey dust billowed out, smelling of ages. Ilara and Leo recoiled, coughing, waving the air in front of their faces. The air inside was visibly thick, a fog of neglect. It was colder within the tower's shadow, a damp, penetrating cold that felt like it was emanating from the stones themselves. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with abandonment. A shiver, violent and uncontrollable, racked Ilara's body. This wasn't a home. It was the town's attic, its forgotten tomb. Her brief, desperate hope felt like a cruel joke, and she was the punchline. She could feel Leo's despair radiating beside her, a silent, damning indictment of her failure to protect him from this. Putting her shoulder against the wood, she and Leo forced the door open far enough to squeeze through, dragging their meager belongings inside. They were plunged into a gloomy twilight, the only light coming from the open doorway and a few highly grime-covered slits in the stone walls. Before them, a spiral staircase, carved from dark, sweating stone, wound its way up into the oppressive darkness. They began to climb. Each step was treacherous, coated in a slick, gritty film. The air grew heavier, tasting of mold and dampness. The only sounds were their labored breathing and the ominous creak of the ancient wooden treads they stepped on occasionally, which groaned as if threatening to give way. Halfway up, Ilara had to stop, her lungs burning. She pressed her forehead against the icy, weeping stone wall. The cold, a shocking jolt. The nausea returned, stronger this time. She felt dizzy, trapped in a vertical grave. Every step up was a step further down into the depths of her despair. After what felt like an eternity of climbing, the staircase opened into a single, vast circular room at the top of the tower, and the reality of their new home crashed down upon Ilara with the force of a physical assault. It was a scene of utter devastation. 3 of the 4 colossal clock faces were supposed to be windows, but the glass was long gone, shattered into fragments on the floor. Now they were just huge, gaping holes through which the wind shrieked and moaned, a constant, mournful symphony. The floor was a treacherous landscape of rubble, fallen plaster, and everywhere, a thick, crunchy carpet of dried bird droppings that must have been accumulating for decades. In the corners, tangled masses of twigs and refuse formed massive, abandoned nests. A profound sense of violation permeated the space. This room had not been a home for a very long time. It had been a roost, a ruin open to the sky, and her heart sank with the finality of it. But it was the clock mechanism itself that stole her breath. It dominated the center of the room, a monstrous, silent leviathan of brass and iron. It was a forest of gears, some as small as a teacup, others the size of wagon wheels, levers, escapements, and connecting rods formed a complex, poor, 3-dimensional web of machinery, all of it frozen in place. A massive pendulum, a polished brass disc at its end, hung perfectly still, a silent tongue in a dead mouth. The entire apparatus rose from the floor and disappeared into the darkness of the belfry above. It was a magnificent piece of engineering, but its stillness was profoundly unsettling. It was the heart of the tower, and its heart had stopped beating decades ago. It felt like standing in the ribcage of a long-dead giant. Ilara felt an inexplicable wave of sadness for the machine itself, a forgotten titan left to rust away in the dark, a mirror of her own predicament. Ilara took a tentative step closer to the mechanism, the floor crunching under her feet. The smell was overpowering now, a potent cocktail that assaulted her senses. The thick, cloying scent of old, congealed grease mingled with the sharp, metallic tang of rust and the ever-present ooey, acidic ammonia of the bird filth. The air was so heavy with it that she could almost taste it, a foul coating on the back of her throat. She reached out and ran a finger over the surface of a large, toothed gear. It came away coated in a thick, black, sticky grime. She stared at the filth on her fingertip, and in that moment, the last flickering ember of her hope was snuffed out completely. It left behind nothing but a cold, brittle ash in her chest. This place couldn't be cleaned. It couldn't be fixed. It was a monument to decay, and they were meant to live inside of it. The absurdity and cruelty of her situation were absolute. Her entire body felt heavy, weighted down by a defeat more complete than any she had ever known. Leo hadn't said a word. He walked to the edge of the room, his movements stiff and jerky. He dropped the suitcase he was carrying. It landed on the filthy floor with a soft, dull thud that seemed to be swallowed by the immense dead space. He didn't look at Ilara. He just went to one of the gaping, broken windows and stared out at the grey, indifferent town spread out far below. His back was rigid, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. Ilara watched him, her heart feeling like it was being physically torn in two. She saw the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his shoulders, and she knew he was fighting back tears. He was trying so hard to be the man, to be strong for her, and she had led him to this hole in the sky. The guilt was a physical pain, a sharp blade twisting in her gut. She had failed him. She had failed as a wife, as a financial partner, and now, most devastatingly, as a mother. There was no lower place she could fall. This was so much worse than being homeless on the street. The street, at least, was honest in its indifference. This place was a deception, a false promise that had lured them into its rotten core only to mock them. This tower was an active participant in their misery. Ilara's legs finally gave out. She sank down onto the floor, not caring about the dirt, the grime, the utter filth. The cold of the stone seeped through her thin clothes instantly, a chilling finality that seemed to crawl right into her bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, but she couldn't stop shaking. She buried her face in her hands, the rough texture of her palms scraping against her skin. The tears she had fought back for so long finally came, not in loud sobs, but in silent, hot streams that traced paths through the dirt on her cheeks. There was no one to see, no one to hear, just the wind howling through the broken windows, a lonely, desolate sound that perfectly matched the emptiness inside her. The dream was over. There was no hope here. There was no electricity for her sewing machine, no running water to wash away the grime, no heat to fight off the bone-deep chill. There was only the cold, the filth, and the oppressive presence of the enormous, dead clock mechanism. This wasn't a shelter. It was a cage, suspended high above the world, exposed to the elements and to the scorn of the town below. It was a prison of last resort. Ilara clutched the worn fabric of her purse, the $87 inside a pathetic reminder of how utterly she had failed. It wasn't enough to start over. It was barely enough to survive another few days. Staring into the darkness between her fingers, she felt a profound and terrifying void open up inside her. It was the absolute zero of hope. She was no longer just on the verge of rock bottom. She was there, lying broken on its cold, unforgiving floor, with nothing left to lose. The first days in the tower were a living nightmare, a Sisyphean struggle against decades of filth. Ilara and Leo worked from the grey light of dawn until the chilling dusk, their hands raw, their muscles screaming in protest. The primary task was creating a single, livable corner in the vast, ruined room. The sound of their sweeping was a small, lonely whisper against the constant, moaning howl of the wind through the broken windows. Every bucket of water had to be hauled up the endless spiral staircase from a public tap a kilometre away. It was a cold, grueling journey that left Ilara breathless, her heart a painful drum against her ribs. The water, freezing to the touch, barely made a dent in the grime. Her meager $87 dwindled with every purchase of soap, cheap bread and candles. The light from the candles cast long, dancing shadows that made the silent clock mechanism look like a watching monster. Despair was a constant, cold companion, wrapping its tendrils around her heart. The smell was a physical assault, a miasma of decay that clung to their clothes and hair, a perfume of poverty. Ammonia from the cleaning supplies fought a losing battle against the pungent, acidic stench of bird droppings and the deep, musty odor of damp stone and rot. Ilara's stomach was in a constant state of turmoil, a knot of hunger and nausea. She would often find herself stopping, leaning against the cold stone, her body trembling with exhaustion and a sense of utter futility. She would watch Leo working, his young face set in a mask of grim determination, and her own failure would wash over her in a suffocating wave. He was 16. He should have been worried about school, about girls, not about where their next meal was coming from or how to scrub a century of filth from a floor. The sight of his chapped, bleeding knuckles was a constant, burning accusation. He never complained, and his silence was somehow worse than any angry words. It was the silence of a childhood being stolen. They slept huddled together for warmth on a small patch of floor they had managed to scrub clean, their 2 suitcases serving as a windbreak. They used their spare clothes as blankets, but the penetrating cold of the tower was relentless. It seeped up from the stones, a damp, grave-like chill that settled deep in their bones. Ilara would lie awake for hours, listening to the shrieking wind and the skittering sounds of unseen things in the darkness. Rats, she assumed. The thought sent a cold dread through her. Every night, the same questions circled in her exhausted mind. What have I done? How will we survive this? The hope she'd felt in the clerk's office had curdled into a bitter poison. This tower wasn't a shelter, it was a vertical tomb, and she had willingly walked them into it. She felt a profound loneliness, a sense that they had slipped through the cracks of the world and ceased to exist. Their suffering was silent, unseen, and absolute. After 3 days of relentless scrubbing, a small corner of the room was declared clean. It was a laughable claim, but the wood of the floor was visible, and the immediate stench of bird droppings had been replaced by the less offensive smell of damp wood and soap. This small victory felt monumental. It was here they established their base, a tiny island in a sea of filth. To expand their sanctuary, they had to confront the Leviathan in the center of the room, the clock mechanism. It was impossible to clean around it. Debris, fallen plaster, and ancient nests were tangled in its massive gears and levers. It had to be cleared. Leo, filled with a restless energy that Ilara no longer possessed, announced he would take on the task. Ilara felt a pang of fear. The machine was a mountain of rust and grease, its parts heavy and precariously balanced. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please, Leo, be careful." The thought of another accident was more than she could bear. Leo, armed with a bucket of soapy water and a stiff brush, began his assault on the machine. He was methodical, starting at the base and working his way around the perimeter. The sound of his scrubbing echoed in the vast space, a small, determined sound of life against the dead silence of the clock. Ilara watched him, her heart a mixture of pride and terror. He was so focused, so intent on imposing order on the chaos. He worked for hours, his face and arms soon covered in a black film of grease and grime. He didn't seem to notice the foul smell or the biting cold. He was a boy at war with a ruin. He began to focus on the most prominent part of the lower mechanism, a massive toothed wheel connected to a series of levers, identified in a faded diagram as the escapement. It was the part that controlled the clock's ticking, and it was caked in a thick, almost tar-like layer of congealed oil and dust. He scrubbed at it with a frustrated intensity, trying to reveal the metal beneath. His hand, slippery with soap and grease, slipped. The rough edge of one of the large metal teeth on the escapement wheel scraped his knuckles. He hissed in pain, pulling his hand back. A thin line of red welled up on his skin. Annoyed, he was about to move on when something caught his eye. Where his hand had wiped away the thickest grime, the metal underneath wasn't uniformly dark. There was a mark. It wasn't a scratch from his fall. It was a series of fine, deliberate lines etched into the surface of the metal tooth. It was completely different from the crude, functional nature of the rest of the machinery. He leaned closer, the smell of old iron and grease filling his nostrils. He squinted in the dim light. It was an image, a small, stylized bird. Its wings swept back as if in mid-flight. It was elegant, intricate, and utterly out of place on this industrial beast. A shiver, not of cold, but of curiosity, prickled the back of his neck. "Mom, come look at this," he called out, his voice echoing slightly. Ilara, who had been trying to mend a tear in their last spare blanket, looked up, her body aching. Her first instinct was to dismiss it. She was too tired for games, too consumed by their grim reality. But there was an urgency in Leo's voice she hadn't heard in weeks. She slowly got to her feet, her joints protesting, and made her way over to the mechanism. "What is it?" she asked, her tone weary. Leo pointed. "Here, on this tooth, look." Ilara bent down, her eyes struggling to focus in the gloom. She saw the bird, her breath caught in her throat. It was beautiful. As a seamstress, she understood precision, the artistry of a deliberate line. This was no factory marking. This was the work of an artist, a signature hidden in plain sight, an inexplicable feeling, a tiny flicker of something other than despair, stirred in her chest. Leo, seeing her fascination, acted on a sudden impulse. He pressed his thumb firmly onto the etching. There was no resistance, just a faint, dry click, a sound so quiet it was almost lost in the moan of the wind. Ilara and Leo both flinched. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a perfectly square section of the metal tooth, the part with the bird etched on it, popped open. It was a tiny, spring-loaded panel, no bigger than a postage stamp, its seams so perfectly flush with the surrounding metal that it had been completely invisible. Ilara's heart, which had been beating a slow, tired rhythm, suddenly leaped into her throat. She stared at the small, dark opening, her mind reeling. This was impossible. It defied logic. Machines like this weren't built with such secrets. Inside the tiny compartment, nestled on a bed of what looked like faded, crumbling red velvet, lay a single object. It glinted with a soft, dull yellow light, absorbing the gloom of the room and giving it back as a warm promise. It was a key, an old ornate key made of solid brass. They both stared, frozen, at the impossible sight. The key was a tangible piece of a forgotten story, a physical question mark lying in the heart of the dead machine. Leo reached out a trembling hand and carefully lifted it from its velvet bed. It was heavier than it looked. He placed it in Ilara's palm. The metal was cold, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her body. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a feeling other than misery or fear coursed through her. It was pure, unadulterated curiosity, a powerful surge of adrenaline that momentarily banished her exhaustion. A secret. They had found a secret. It was a tiny thing, this key, but it was a crack in the monolithic wall of their despair. A loop had opened, A question demanded an answer. Where does this key go? What does it open? A frantic, wild energy seized them both. Suddenly, the tower was no longer just a prison. It was a puzzle box, and they were holding the first piece. The next 7 days were a blur of desperate, focused activity. The grim chore of survival was replaced by the thrilling hunt for a lock. The key became their obsession, a totem of hope they passed between them. They scoured every inch of the clock tower, their search taking them to places they hadn't dared to explore before. They descended into the tower's lower levels, their candles cutting through a darkness that felt ancient and undisturbed. The air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and stone. They found forgotten storage rooms filled with rotting furniture, broken tools, and crates of solidified chemicals, all covered in a thick blanket of pale, ghostly dust. Each discovery of an old footlocker or a padlocked cabinet sent a jolt of hope through them. Elara would hold her breath as Leo inserted the key, but it never fit. The key was too large, too small, or the wrong shape. The excitement of the hunt began to curdle into a familiar, bitter frustration. Each failure was a small, stinging disappointment. The key, once a symbol of hope, began to feel like another cruel joke played by the tower, a piece of a puzzle with no solution. Elara found an old iron-strapped chest tucked away in a dusty alcove. Her heart pounded as she imagined what might be inside. She spent an hour painstakingly cleaning the grime from its intricate lock, her fingers clumsy with anticipation, but the brass key wouldn't even enter the keyhole. The letdown was sharp and painful. She sank back on her heels, the candle flame flickering, casting her long, defeated shadow on the wall. Leo, too, was growing despondent. His youthful optimism was eroding with each failed attempt. He began kicking angrily at the debris, his frustration echoing in the stone-walled silence. "It's useless," he muttered one evening, throwing the key onto their makeshift bed. "It's just an old key. It probably doesn't open anything in here at all." Elara felt her own hope waver. Maybe he was right. The key lay on the rough blanket, its brass surface catching the flickering candlelight. It seemed to mock them. Their frantic search had yielded nothing but more dust and disappointment. The initial thrill had completely evaporated, leaving them more exhausted and disheartened than before. They had taken a gamble on a mystery, and it seemed they had lost. The grim reality of their situation came crashing back down. The last of their $87 was almost gone. The cold was getting worse. The hunt for the lock had been a distraction, a brief, fantastical escape from their hopeless reality. Now the fantasy was over. Elara picked up the key, its weight familiar in her palm. She felt a surge of anger at the inanimate object. It had promised a secret, a change in their fortunes, but had delivered only false hope, a specialty of this wretched tower. She was about to hurl it into the darkness, to send it clattering into some forgotten corner, but something stopped her. She sank down onto the floor, her back against the cold wall of their clean corner, and just stared at the key. The tower was silent except for the wind. Leo was asleep, his face relaxed for the first time in days. In the quiet, a thought began to form in Elara's mind, slow and methodical, like her stitching. They had searched the tower, but they had not truly searched the clock. They had found the key in the clock. It stood to reason that the lock would be there as well. It was so obvious. She felt a flush of foolishness. Her gaze drifted across the room to the monstrous, silent mechanism. It was a machine of incomprehensible complexity, a forest of metal. To search it properly would be like searching a mountain for a single stone. The task felt overwhelming, impossible. But the alternative was to surrender completely, to accept that this was their life now. A stubborn resolve, born of desperation, began to harden within her. She would not give up. Not yet. Her gaze was no longer frantic, but analytical. She studied the key in her hand, really looked at it for the first time, not as a tool, but as a clue. The bow. The part you hold down wasn't a simple loop. It was ornate, shaped into a circle with delicate spokes, like a tiny wheel, and in the very center of the wheel, intricately carved, was the same stylized bird, its wings spread in flight. Her breath hitched. It was a perfect match for the etching Leo had found. The key and the clue were one. Her eyes immediately began to scan the massive clock mechanism, no longer looking for a keyhole, but for a pattern. She was looking for a decorative wheel with a bird at its center. She let her eyes trace the paths of levers, the curves of gears, the solid frames that held the machine together. It was a dizzying, complex landscape of metal, and the candlelight threw confusing, shifting shadows over everything. For a long time she saw nothing but machinery. Her eyes were starting to burn from the strain, and a headache was beginning to pulse behind her temples. She was about to give up, to let the exhaustion claim her, when her gaze fell upon the largest single component of the entire mechanism, the mainspring barrel. It was a massive steel cylinder, wider than she was tall, positioned near the base. It was supposed to contain the enormous coiled spring that powered the entire clock. Its flat end cap, facing her, was not plain. It was covered in a web of delicate, swirling engravings, a touch of artistry amidst the industrial function. And there, in the very center of the cap, serving as the focal point of the entire design, was a small, engraved circle with spokes, a wheel, and in the center of that wheel was the bird. The exact same bird from the key. A powerful shock, a jolt of pure discovery, shot through her. Her heart stopped, then began to hammer against her ribs with a violent, triumphant rhythm. She scrambled across the floor, her exhaustion forgotten, the key clutched in her hand like a holy relic. Leo stirred at the noise, sitting up, his eyes blinking in confusion. "Mom, what is it?" Ilara didn't answer. She was on her knees in front of the massive steel barrel, her face inches from the engraving. She ran her trembling fingers over the cool, smooth metal. The design was seamless. There was no visible outline of a keyhole, no break in the pattern. It was perfect. Doubt crept in. Was it just a coincidence? A recurring artistic motif of the clockmaker? No, it couldn't be. The feeling in her gut, a deep, primal intuition, told her she was right. Leo was beside her now, his eyes wide with a returning hope. "It's the bird," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's the same one." Ilara looked from the engraving to the key in her hand. The key fit the story. It had to fit the lock. But where was it? She traced the outline of the tiny bird. Then she saw it, or rather, she felt it. As her fingertip traced the bird's body, it dipped into a minuscule indentation, right where the bird's eye should be. It was no bigger than a pinprick, and completely invisible in the dim light. It was not a flaw in the metal, it was deliberate. Her entire body went cold. The level of concealment was astonishing. This wasn't just a lock. It was a secret meant to be kept forever. With a hand that shook so violently she could barely control it, she lifted the brass key. She didn't try to insert the whole key, only the very tip. She guided it toward the pinprick in the center of the bird's eye. The metal tip slid into the tiny hole with a soft, satisfying whisper of metal on metal. It was a perfect fit. The keyhole wasn't a gaping maw. It was a tiny surgical incision in the heart of the secret. A shiver of pure, unadulterated terror and excitement coursed through Ilara. This was a secret someone had been willing to kill for. Ilara took a deep breath, the cold, dusty air filling her lungs. The smell of old grease and metal hung heavy. She gripped the brass key, its weight an anchor of reality in the midst of the unbelievable. Her hands trembled as she inserted it fully into the newly revealed keyhole. The key slid home with an oiled smoothness, as if it had been waiting for decades. She could feel the internal tumblers aligning. With a held breath, she turned the key. There wasn't a loud clunk, but rather a series of soft, metallic whispers from within the barrel, like the secrets of a ghost being released. The entire end cap didn't swing open. Instead, a barely visible circular seam appeared around the edge of the large steel plate. A low groan of protesting metal echoed in the quiet room as the seal of time and rust was broken. The lock had been defeated. The question now was what lay behind it. The suspense was a physical pressure in her chest. With the key turned, the end cap was loose. Ilara placed her palms flat against the cold steel and pushed. It moved, scraping slightly, and then came free in her hands. She almost dropped it, surprised by its weight. She and Leo peered at its reverse side. It was not a solid plate of steel. It had been expertly hollowed out, a heavy facade designed to look and feel like the real thing. Behind it, there was not the massive, greasy coil of a mainspring she had expected to see. There was only a dark, circular void, a hollow chamber. The entire mainspring barrel was a lie. It was a safe built into the very heart of the clock, its existence a secret known only to its creator. The sheer genius and paranoia of it was breathtaking. Ilara felt a wave of dizziness. They were treading on ground that was both sacred and deeply dangerous. The hidden space seemed to breathe a cold, ancient air out at them. Peering into the chamber, Ilara could see nothing but absolute blackness. The air that wafted out was cool and dry, carrying a scent entirely different from the rest of the tower. It wasn't the industrial smell of oil and rust, but a dry, papery scent, the smell of old leather, sealing wax and something else. A faint, crisp, unmistakable aroma of old money. It was the smell of a forgotten vault. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. This was it, the answer. Trying to control the trembling in her hands, Ilara reached into the cold, dark interior. Her fingertips brushed against the curved wall, then found something solid. It was metal, its surface cool and smooth, and it was heavy, far heavier than it should be. She gripped its edges, her fingers finding purchase, and began to pull it out of the darkness, her muscles straining with the effort and the unbearable anticipation of the reveal. She dragged the object into the candlelight. It was a heavy tin box, about the size of a shoebox, its surface plain and dark. The only feature was the thick, hardened wax that sealed the lid to the body, a dark red substance that had cracked and yellowed with age. It was completely unadorned, its purpose solely to protect what was inside. She and Leo knelt on the floor, staring at it. The wind howled through the broken window, but they didn't hear it. Their entire world had shrunk to this single, mysterious object. It sat between them on the dusty floorboards, a physical manifestation of a decades-old secret. The air in the room felt thick, charged with static electricity. This box held the answer to the key, the purpose of the hidden safe, and, Ilara felt with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, the reason for the tower's long silence. Opening it felt like the most important and most dangerous thing she had ever done in her life. There was no lock on the box itself. The wax seal was the only thing holding it shut. Finding a small, sharp-edged piece of metal from the floor, Ilara began to carefully scrape and pry at the brittle wax. The act felt like a desecration, like breaking into a tomb. Flakes of dark red wax fell away, releasing a faint, spicy scent. It took several long, tense minutes, the only sound the scraping of metal against metal and their own ragged breathing. Finally, she broke the seal in one corner and was able to work the piece of metal under the lid. With a final, groaning shriek of tortured tin, the lid bent and came free. Ilara set it aside, her hands shaking. She and Leo leaned forward together, peering into the box. The sight that met their eyes made Ilara let out a small, sharp gasp. Her mind simply couldn't process what she was seeing. It was a treasure, not of gold or jewels, but of paper. The box was filled to the very brim with neatly bundled stacks, bearer bonds. The paper was thick and cream-colored, the engraving on them intricate and official. The masthead of a national bank was clearly visible. Each bond had a date, and as Ilara lifted the top bundle, she saw they were all from the early 1970s. She had a vague understanding of what they were, financial instruments that belonged to whoever held them, like cash, and there were dozens of bundles, stacks upon stacks of them. It was a fortune, a life-shattering, impossible fortune. It was enough money to escape this tower, to escape Oakhaven, to give Leo the life he deserved, to start over 100 times. The sheer, dumbfounding reality of it was too much. Tears began to well in her eyes, not of sadness, but of pure, overwhelming shock. She felt lightheaded, the room spinning around the impossible treasure in front of her. This box didn't just hold money, it held freedom. Her trembling hands dug deeper into the box, past the stacks of bonds. Her fingers brushed against something different at the very bottom, something softer, warmer than paper. She carefully lifted out the bundles of bonds, her movements reverent, and set them on the floor. There, lying at the bottom of the tin box, was a small leather-bound book, a diary. Its dark brown cover was worn smooth at the edges, a testament to its age or its use. The leather was dry and cool to the touch. It felt infinitely more personal and far more dangerous than the stacks of anonymous money. A cold dread began to snake its way up Ilara's spine, chilling the initial euphoria of her discovery. The bonds were a treasure, a simple, clean solution to her problems. But this diary, this felt like the truth, And the truth, she suspected, was neither simple nor clean. It was the reason for the secrecy, the reason for this elaborate hiding place. With a sense of profound gravity, she picked up the diary. As she turned it over in her hands, she saw a small, dark, rust-colored stain that had soaked into the leather on the corner of the back cover. It looked unnervingly like old, dried blood. Her heart skipped a beat. She forced the thought from her mind and opened the book. The pages were brittle, the paper yellowed. The inside cover had a name written in an elegant, looping script. Arthur Pendleton, horologist, the clockmaker. A wave of cold passed through Ilara. This was his story. She turned to the first entry, her eyes scanning the precise, beautiful handwriting. The date was April 12, 1975. The first sentence hit her with the force of a physical blow. He has forced my hand. The general. I am to become a vault for his sins. Ilara's blood ran cold. She read on, May God forgive me, for this clock will now keep a secret of blood and theft. This wasn't a discovery. It was an inheritance of profound danger. The diary felt like a block of ice in Ilara's hands, its coldness seeping into her skin. A stark contrast to the impossible heat of the discovery moments before. The name, Arthur Pendleton, seemed to vibrate on the page. Horologist, clockmaker. The air in the tower, already thick with the smell of dust and decay, now seemed charged with a new, more sinister scent. The dry, brittle aroma of a 50-year-old secret. She felt Leo press closer, his warmth a small comfort against the sudden, bone-deep chill that had seized her. The words she had read, a vault for his sin, echoed in her mind, a pronouncement of doom. The bonds on the floor, once a symbol of impossible hope, now felt tainted, like evidence at a crime scene. Ilara's heart, which had soared with the prospect of freedom, now plummeted into a new and terrifying abyss. This was not a treasure map. It was a confession that had been sealed in darkness, waiting for someone to unearth its terrible burden. The responsibility felt like a physical weight settling on her shoulders. With a trembling finger, she turned the fragile page. The ink was a faded sepia, the script precise, yet the pressure of the pen revealed a desperate urgency. September 6, 1975. The general brought the bonds today. He came in the night, his face a mask of cold authority. The money, he called it, a necessary contingency for the preservation of order. I heard the real story whispered in the tavern, of farmers forced from their land, their deeds signed over at gunpoint, of dissenters who vanished, their families paid for their silence with these very notes. He laughed as his men stacked the boxes, a cold, empty sound. They are bearer bonds, Arthur, he said. No names, no history, just wealth. But I see the history. I see the faces of the dispossessed in the intricate scrollwork of the paper. This clock tower is no longer a monument to time, but a tomb for justice. Ilara felt a wave of nausea. The money on the floor wasn't a windfall. It was blood money, the collected tears of countless victims, and it was now hers to hold. She read on, her eyes devouring the clockmaker's guilt-ridden prose. October 19, 1975. I have finished the modification. The mainspring barrel is a lie, a hollow shell. I worked in secret by candlelight, my own tools feeling like a burglar's implements. The precision required was immense, the fear of discovery a constant, cold sweat on my neck. The key is my only comfort, a small piece of artistry in a project of pure evil. I have hidden its clue in plain sight, a small bird, a symbol of a freedom I have helped to cage. The general suspects nothing. He sees me as a simple craftsman, a tool to be used and discarded. He does not know that I have documented everything. The bond serial numbers, the dates, the names of the men who came with him. This diary is the true key. One day, when the shadow of this regime has passed, I will see this undone. I will give this clock its voice back, and it will sing a song of truth. Ilara's breath hitched. The clockmaker wasn't just a victim. He was a silent rebel, a witness who had built an ark for the truth. The next few entries were frantic, the elegant script becoming a jagged scrawl. On November 5th, 1975, someone was here. I found a floorboard scuffed near the base of the mechanism, a faint smell of cigar smoke, the brand the general favors. Does he suspect? Did I leave a trace? The paranoia is a poison in my blood. I see his men's faces in every shadow. I hear whispers in the wind that howls through the belfry. I have told my loyal apprentice, young Abel, nothing. I cannot endanger the boy. He is a good lad, with a watchmaker's steady hands and an honest heart. He deserves a life free of this darkness. I must protect him. I must protect the secret. But the weight of it is crushing me. I feel like one of my own clockwork gears, wound so tight that I am about to shatter. Ilara felt a profound pity for this ghost, this man trapped in his own creation, haunted by the very secret he was sworn to protect. The name Abel lodged itself in her mind, another piece of the unfolding, terrifying puzzle. Then she found it. The final entry. The paper was slightly wrinkled, as if from a damp hand. The date was stark. November 12, 1975. The handwriting was rushed, almost illegible. He knows, I am sure of it. His lawyer, a man with eyes like a snake, was asking questions in town about my work schedule. They are closing in. I have made a decision. I will go to the capital tomorrow. I have a contact, a journalist who is not afraid of the military. The truth will be my shield. I am leaving this diary in the safe. If something happens to me, if I do not return, then this clock holds my final testament. Let it be known that Arthur Pendleton was not a coward. Let it be known that the general is a thief and a monster. Below this, a single horrifying sentence was added, as if an afterthought. My car's steering feels loose. I will have it checked before I leave. A cold, metallic dread flooded Ilara's veins. Loose steering, an accident. The words were a gunshot in the silent room. A tragic accident. The foreman's hollow words from 3 months ago slammed into her consciousness with the force of a physical blow. Her husband, the construction site, the unexplained malfunction. Ilara dropped the diary as if it had burned her. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a scream. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence, decades apart. But the sick feeling in her gut, the icy certainty that was crystallizing in her heart, told her it was no coincidence at all. The pattern was identical. A man who knew a secret, a convenient, fatal accident. Her husband, Thomas, a low-level maintenance worker. He must have found this diary. He must have read these words just as she was doing now. And he, like Arthur Pendleton, had been silenced. The realization was a tidal wave of horror that drowned her, pulling her under. Her husband hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered. The grief she had been processing was a lie. Underneath it was something far colder, far sharper, rage, and a terrifying, paralyzing fear. Leo saw the color drain from her face. "Mom! Mom! What is it? What did you read?" he asked, his voice cracking with alarm. Ilara couldn't speak. She could only point a trembling finger at the open diary, at the final, damning words. The shared knowledge passed between them in a silent, horrific instant. She saw the understanding dawn in his eyes, followed by the same wave of terror that was choking her. They weren't just poor and homeless anymore. They were witnesses. They were the keepers of a secret that 2 men had already died to protect. The clock tower was no longer a ruin or a puzzle box. It was a tomb they were sharing with ghosts, and the killer was still out there, living with his wealth and his power, a monster hiding in plain sight. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind. It sounded now like a warning. They were no longer alone in their misery. They were being watched by the ghosts of the past and the predators of the present. The sound came an hour later, cutting through the thick tapestry of their fear. It was the low, powerful purr of an expensive car engine, a sound utterly alien to this neglected hilltop. It wasn't the sputtering engine of a town local. It was smooth, confident, and it was coming closer. Ilara and Leo froze, their eyes locking in shared panic. The engine cut off, plunging the world back into silence. Then the crunch of expensive leather shoes on the gravel path below. Each footstep was deliberate, measured, and terrifyingly loud in the dead quiet. They were footsteps of a man who owned the ground he walked on. A moment later, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed on the massive wooden door at the base of the tower. It wasn't a tentative tap. It was a summons. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. Her first instinct was to hide the diary, the bonds. She scrambled to shove them back into the tin box, her fingers clumsy with sheer terror. "Don't make a sound," she whispered to Leo, her voice a dry rasp. The knocking came again, louder this time, more impatient. It reverberated up through the stone structure, a physical vibration of menace. They couldn't just hide. Whoever was down there knew they were here. Staying silent would only confirm they had something to hide. Ilara's mind raced. The residency right was legal. They had a right to be here. She had to answer. She had to pretend everything was normal. Taking a shaky breath that did nothing to calm the frantic pounding in her chest, she motioned for Leo to stay hidden in the shadows behind the giant clock mechanism. She grabbed a single candle, its flame trembling violently in her hand, and began the long, terrifying descent down the spiral staircase. Each step down felt like a step closer to a guillotine. The air grew colder. The darkness pressed in. As she reached the bottom, the smell of damp stone was overpowered by a new and alien scent seeping from under the door. The faint, clean aroma of expensive cologne. She pulled the heavy door open just a crack, peering out. The man standing there was framed by the grey twilight. He was in his late 60s, tall and immaculately dressed in a dark, tailored suit that seemed to repel the dust and decay of the tower. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his face was a handsome, patrician mask of polite inquiry. But his eyes, a pale, cold blue, held no warmth at all. They were the eyes of a predator, assessing her, dismissing her in a single glance. He smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. "Mrs. Coleman, I am Alistair Finch. Forgive the intrusion." The name hit Ilara like a physical shock. Finch. She didn't know the name, but she felt a primal certainty that he was connected to the general, to this whole nightmare. His voice was smooth, cultured, but it had an undercurrent of steel. He radiated an aura of effortless power, a man who had never been told no, and who had never had to ask for anything twice. He was danger personified, standing on her doorstep. "I am the legal representative for the Oakhaven Redevelopment Council," Finch continued, his gaze sweeping past her, taking in the squalor of the tower's base. His expression was one of carefully veiled disgust. "I understand you've taken up residence." He said the word as if it were a foul taste in his mouth. Ilara just nodded, unable to find her voice. Her throat was tight with fear. He could surely hear the frantic thumping of her heart. "A commendable, if desperate, use of an old town charter," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "However, the council has plans for this hill, a full demolition and redevelopment. This tower is a blight, an eyesore, and, I must be frank, a death trap." He let that word hang in the air. Ilara felt a cold sweat break out on her back. He was leading her somewhere, laying a trap with his words, and she had no choice but to walk into it. She felt utterly powerless, a mouse staring up at a hawk. Her hand on the door trembled. She prayed he couldn't see it in the dim light. "The council," he said, pulling a long, slim envelope from his inner jacket pocket, "is prepared to be generous. We understand your difficult circumstances. We are authorized to offer you $5,000 for your residency rights, a cash payment. It would be enough for you and your boy to find a proper apartment, to start again, somewhere else." $5,000. The number was an insult. After seeing the fortune in bonds hidden in the clock, it was a pittance, a handful of scraps thrown to a beggar. But an hour ago, that sum would have been a miracle. He was testing her. He was trying to see what she knew. Ilara's mind was a whirlwind of terror and calculation. If she refused, would he become suspicious? If she accepted, would she be signing her and Leo's death warrant, proving they were no longer a threat? The air grew thick and heavy. The choice he was offering her felt like no choice at all. It was a command disguised as a transaction, and she could feel the unspoken threat coiled beneath his polite words. Ilara found her voice, though it came out as a weak, reedy whisper. I'll have to think about it." Finch's smile didn't waver, but the coldness in his eyes intensified. "There isn't much to think about, Mrs. Coleman. It's a generous offer. Far more than this claim is worth." He took a half-step forward, invading her space, and lowered his voice to a confidential, menacing tone. "This is a dangerous place, structurally unsound. Old buildings like this, they have a way of settling. Things fall. Tragic accidents happen." He let the phrase, the exact same phrase used for her husband and for the clockmaker, hang in the air between them like a shroud. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. It was a confession, a threat and a confession delivered with a smile. The confirmation of her deepest fears was so blatant, so arrogant, that it left her breathless. He wasn't just a murderer, he was proud of it, confident in his untouchable power. The evil was not a ghost, it was standing right in front of her. He then let his gaze drift past her, up into the darkness of the winding staircase, where he knew Leo was hiding. The shift was subtle, but its meaning was unmistakable. His pale blue eyes came back to meet hers, and the thin smile returned, but it was now a predatory baring of teeth. "You have a son, don't you? A boy of 16, I believe. It would be a terrible shame if he were to get hurt playing in such a dangerous, unstable place." The threat was no longer veiled. It was naked, brutal, and aimed directly at the one thing in the world she had left to love. The air left Ilara's lungs in a silent rush. Her entire body went rigid. The fear she felt was no longer just for herself. It was a primal, animal terror for the life of her child. The tin box, the bonds, the diary, they all faded into insignificance. All that mattered was the clear and present danger to Leo. The world narrowed to this single horrifying moment. A mother being told her child's life was in her hands. Finch placed the envelope on the dusty threshold, a white rectangle of temptation and terror. "Be out by the end of the week, Mrs. Coleman. Take the money. It's the smart play." He gave a final, chillingly polite nod, turned, and walked back to his car, his footsteps crunching on the gravel with the same unhurried confidence. Ilara stood frozen in the doorway, watching the red taillights disappear down the hill, leaving her alone in the suffocating darkness with the echo of his words. The secret in the heart of the clock was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a weapon pointed directly at her son's head. She was trapped between a killer's greed and a mother's terror. With the ghosts of the past screaming for justice and a very real monster promising a future of pain. What would you do in her place? Would you take the money, ensuring your child's immediate safety, but letting a murderer walk free? Or would you hold on to the truth, risking everything for a justice that might never come? Ilara slammed the heavy door shut, the sound a dull, hopeless thud that failed to block out the echo of Finch's words. The envelope lay on the floor inside, a pale rectangle of poison on the dusty stone. She didn't touch it. She backed away from it as if it were a venomous snake, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. A terrible, icy calm descended over her, the kind that follows a catastrophic shock. The threat hadn't just been spoken, it had been delivered like a business proposal, its casual cruelty a testament to Finch's absolute confidence. Her mind replayed his gaze, as it had drifted upward toward the darkness where Leo was hiding. It was a look of ownership, as if her son's life was just another asset he could leverage or discard at will. A primal rage, cold and sharp, began to cut through the fog of her fear. This wasn't about money anymore. This was a war, and her son's life was the battlefield. The weight of this knowledge was a physical pressure, crushing the air from her lungs. She stumbled back up the spiral staircase, her legs feeling like lead. Each step an monumental effort. The single candle flame cast her shadow, huge and distorted, dancing on the curved stone wall like a frantic ghost. Leo met her at the top, his face a pale mask of fear in the flickering light. "Mom, I heard," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I heard what he said." He didn't need to say more. The threat lingered in the cold air between them, a tangible entity. Lara wanted to wrap him in her arms, to lie and say everything would be all right, but the words wouldn't come. The lie was too big, the danger too immediate. Instead, she felt a profound, chilling shift within herself. The despair that had defined her existence in this tower was burning away, replaced by something harder, something forged in the fire of a mother's terror. It was a terrifying clarity. They couldn't run. They couldn't hide. Finch had found them once. He would find them again. Justice was no longer an abstract concept. It was the only path to survival. The name swam up from the depths of her memory, a single word from the clockmaker's final, frantic entries. Abel. My loyal apprentice, young Abel. The words from the diary resonated with a new, desperate significance. A good lad, with a watchmaker's steady hands and an honest heart. Was he still alive? Could he possibly still be in Oakhaven after 50 years? It was a sliver of a chance, a thread of hope so thin it was almost invisible, but it was all she had. The alternative was to wait for Finch's accident to befall them. Ilara grabbed the small leather diary, its worn cover feeling both like a death warrant and a sacred text. "Leo, stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone," she commanded, her voice imbued with a new, steely authority that surprised even herself. She tucked the diary inside her coat, the small hard book a shield against her ribs. She had to find Abel. He was the only living link to Arthur Pendleton, the only person in the world who might know the depth of the darkness she had uncovered. Leaving the tower felt like stepping from one prison into another. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her like a grasping hand. The wind, which had been a constant mournful companion, now sounded like a chorus of whispers, carrying Finch's threats. As she hurried down the hill toward the distant lights of Oakhaven, a suffocating paranoia enveloped her. Every car that passed on the road below sent a jolt of panic through her. Was it him? Was it his men? The town, which had seemed merely indifferent before, now felt actively hostile. Its windows like 1,000 cold Yastahan watching eyes. She felt exposed, marked. The diary inside her coat was a burning weight, a secret that she was sure was visible to everyone she passed. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her spine. The air, crisp with the coming night, tasted of fear. She was a ghost moving through a town owned by her monster, searching for another ghost from a forgotten past. She found the name in a dusty, yellowed phone book at a public telephone booth, the paper so brittle it threatened to crumble in her hands. Abel's timepieces, repairs and restoration. The address was on a small, forgotten side street near the old market square, a part of Oakhaven that time seemed to have overlooked. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled her knees, washed over her. He was real. He existed. As she approached the address, the sounds of the town faded, replaced by a strange, new soundscape. It was a gentle, rhythmic chorus of ticking. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of clocks, all ticking in a soft, asynchronous symphony. The sound emanated from a small shop with a dark green, peeling door and a large glass window so clouded with dust it was almost opaque. Above the door, a hanging wooden sign, carved in the shape of a pocket watch, swayed and creaked in the wind. The name, Abel's, was barely legible. The shop felt like an island, a pocket of the past preserved against the flow of the present. Ilara pushed the door open, a small bell tinkling overhead, a cheerful sound that was immediately swallowed by the overwhelming symphony of ticks and tocks. The air inside was warm and smelled of brass polish, old wood, and lubricating oil. It was the scent of meticulous care, the absolute opposite of the clock tower's stench of neglect. Every available surface, walls, shelves, countertops, was covered in clocks. Grandfather clocks stood like silent sentinels along the walls, their pendulums swinging in silent, hypnotic arcs. Mantel clocks ticked softly on shelves, and the glass of display cases glinted, revealing the intricate guts of pocket watches laid out like surgical specimens. It was a room drowning in time, a horologist's dream, and a hoarder's nightmare. The sheer density of ticking was a physical presence, a sound you could feel in your bones. It was a sanctuary of precision, a world away from the brutal, chaotic reality she had just fled. A sense of peace, fragile but real, settled over her. From behind a tall counter cluttered with tiny tools and magnifying loupes, a figure emerged. He was ancient, far older than she had imagined, a man who seemed to be made of paper and wire. His back was bent into a permanent question mark, and his skin was a roadmap of wrinkles. He wore a watchmaker's visor on his forehead, and his eyes, when he looked up at her, were magnified by his thick glasses, but behind the lenses they were shockingly sharp and alert, the eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime looking at the smallest, most important details. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a dry, quiet rustle, like the turning of a delicate page. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, every motion economical and precise. This had to be him. This was Abel. Ilara's throat went dry. The words she had rehearsed on her frantic walk abandoned her. She felt like a child confessing a terrible sin, standing before the weight of his 80-plus years of life. She stood there for a long moment, the chorus of ticking clocks filling the silence. The old man watched her, his head tilted with a patient curiosity. Finally, she found her voice, though it came out as a choked whisper. "My name is Elara Coleman. My husband, he was the custodian of the Oakhaven clock tower." At the mention of the tower, a flicker of something, interest, or perhaps a long dormant memory, stirred in the old man's magnified eyes. He said nothing, simply waiting for her to continue. Elara took a shaky breath. We found something. Inside the clock." She reached into her coat, her hand trembling so violently she could barely grasp the book. She pulled out the small leather diary and placed it on the counter between them. It lay there on the polished wood, an object of immense gravity, a dark and terrible intrusion into this peaceful sanctuary of ticking time. The old man's gaze fell upon the book, and the world seemed to stop. The moment Abel's eyes focused on the diary, the change in him was profound and immediate. The gentle, scholarly curiosity vanished, replaced by a look of stark, absolute terror. The color drained from his already pale face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. His hand, which had been resting on the counter, jerked back as if the book were white-hot. He stared at it, his mouth falling slightly open, his breath caught in his throat. A low, guttural sound, a strangled moan of recognition and horror, escaped his lips. His magnified eyes darted from the book to Elara's face and back again, wide with a fear that was 50 years old, but as fresh as a new wound. It was the fear of a ghost he thought he had long since buried. "Where?" he finally managed to rasp, his voice cracking. "Where did you get this?" The ticking of 100 clocks seemed to amplify, each tick a hammer blow counting down the seconds of a long-overdue reckoning. Elara explained in a torrent of whispered words the story of her eviction, the discovery of the key, the hollow barrel, the bonds heirs, and finally, the diary. As she spoke, she watched the old man's face crumble. The dam of a lifetime of terrified silence was breaking. When she mentioned the general's name, he flinched as if struck. When she read Arthur Pendleton's final entry about the loose steering gear, a single jewel crystalline tear escaped from behind his thick glasses and traced a slow, glistening path through the deep wrinkles on his cheek. He sank onto a tall stool behind the counter, his frail body seeming to shrink, overwhelmed by the sudden, brutal return of the past. He buried his face in his ancient, trembling hands, and a quiet, dry sob shook his thin shoulders. The sound was devastating in the quiet shop, a sound of grief and guilt that had been suppressed for half a century, now finally, tragically released. He was mourning his master and his own silence. After a long time, he lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, the sharp focus gone, replaced by the haunted look of a man staring into a past he could not escape. "I was there," he whispered, his voice hoarse with unshed tears. "Not at the crash, but the night before. I saw them." He paused, swallowing hard, the memory of physical pain. The general's men, they were always with him. Two brutes in dark suits. They told Arthur the car was making a noise, that they would take a look at it for him. A favor, they called it. Arthur was suspicious, but what could he do? They were the power in this country. You didn't refuse a favor from the general. He stared into the middle distance, his mind 50 years in the past, in the dark garage behind his master's house. The ticking clocks were a slow, funereal march. I was just a boy, an apprentice. I hid in the shadows, and I watched them work on the steering column. They weren't fixing it. They were breaking it. The confession hung in the air, heavy and damning. I heard one of them laugh as they left, Abel continued, his voice barely audible. He said, "Accidents happen." The same words, the exact same words. Elara felt a wave of cold horror wash over her. It was a script, a methodology of murder passed down from father to son. "I wanted to tell someone," Abel rasped, his eyes pleading with her, begging for an absolution she couldn't give. John, I wanted to scream, but I was terrified. The general, he was not a man, he was a force. His reach was everywhere. To speak against him was to sign your own death warrant. Arthur was dead. What could I do? I was a boy. So I said nothing. I kept my head down. I opened this shop. And I have lived with the ghost of my own cowardice every single day for 50 years. He looked at the diary on the counter, his expression a mixture of terror and a strange, profound relief. The truth was out, and he was no longer its sole, terrified keeper. Then he looked at her, his gaze sharpening with a new, dawning horror. "Your husband," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Thomas Coleman. He came here, about a month before he died." Ilara's heart stopped. She gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling. "He came to you," she breathed. Abel nodded slowly, his eyes wide with the terrible significance of it all. Yes, he was a quiet man, very polite. He had some questions about the tower clock. He said he was doing a historical survey for the city records. He asked about Arthur Pendleton. And then he asked about the mainspring barrel. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening force. The validation was absolute, a cold, hard certainty that left no room for doubt. Thomas hadn't stumbled upon the diary. He had been looking for it. He had been investigating. He had gotten close, so close that he had come to the one man who might know the truth. And in doing so, he had signed his own death warrant. He asked if I knew why the barrel was designed with such ornate engraving, so different from the rest of the mechanism. Abel continued, his voice heavy with a new layer of guilt. I lied to him. I told him Arthur was just an artist at heart, prone to decorative flourishes. I was a coward then, and I was a coward again. I sent him away. I sent him to his death. A sob caught in Abel's throat. Ilara felt a strange, detached pity for the old man, but it was drowned out by the fresh wave of her own grief and rage. It was real, all of it. The suspicious accident, the secret debts, perhaps coerced from him by Finch as blackmail, the murder. It was all a cold, calculated plan to silence him. Her husband wasn't just a victim, he was a hero, a quiet man who had tried to right a terrible wrong and had paid for it with his life. The knowledge was both a source of immense pride and unbearable pain. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was the heir to her husband's quest for justice. Abel seemed to find a new resolve in his confession. The stoop in his back lessened, and a fire she hadn't seen before ignited in his pale eyes. "This cannot continue," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Alistair Finch is his father's son, a snake in a tailored suit. He has been searching for those bonds his entire life, the key to solidifying his family's corrupt empire. Your husband's death and now his threats to you. It ends now. It ends tonight." He looked past Ilara, toward the door, as if he could see the dark tower on the hill. "For 50 years, I have lived in fear. But seeing you, knowing what happened to your husband, the fear of doing nothing is finally greater than the fear of what Finch might do. Arthur Pendleton deserves justice. Your husband deserves justice." The quiet watchmaker was gone, replaced by the loyal apprentice, finally ready to honor his master's last wish, no matter the cost. His courage, born from a lifetime of shame, was a small, bright flame in the overwhelming darkness. He hobbled over to an old, roll-top desk in the corner, the wood dark and gleaming. He fumbled with a small key from his pocket and unlocked one of the drawers. From it, he pulled a small, black address book. He flipped through the pages, his gnarled finger tracing the lines of names. "Here," he said, tapping a page. "His name is Ben Carter, an investigative journalist in the capital. He specializes in the cold cases from the dictatorship, unsolved disappearances, financial crimes. He's old school, tenacious, and he fears no one. He knew of my master's accident, always suspected it was more." Abel looked at her, a plan forming on his face. "We cannot go to the local police. Finch owns them, but Carter is outside his reach. We get him the diary, the bond numbers. He can blow this whole thing wide open." A new kind of hope, sharp and dangerous, began to dawn. It wasn't the hope of escape, but the hope of a fight. It was the hope of a reckoning. They made a plan, their hushed voices a frantic counterpoint to the steady ticking of the clocks. Abel would call the journalist, prepare him. Ilara would return to the tower, retrieve the tin box with the bonds, and meet Abel back at his shop. From there, under the cover of darkness, they would find a way to get the evidence to the capital. The risks were immense. Every moment she spent back in that tower was a gamble, but leaving the bonds behind was not an option. They were the proof, the undeniable link between Finch's family and the crimes of the past. They were the weapon they would use to bring him down. Ilara felt a surge of adrenaline that banished her exhaustion. She was no longer a victim cowering in the dark. She was a key player in a dangerous game, holding the move that could mean Checkmate. She thanked Abel, her voice thick with emotion, and slipped back out into the night, the bell over the door tinkling a small, hopeful goodbye. The walk back to the tower was different. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a sense of purpose. The night no longer felt entirely hostile. It was a cloak, a shield that would help her move unseen. She climbed the hill with a steady, determined pace, her lungs burning, but her mind clear. She was no longer just fighting for her and Leo's survival. She was fighting for Arthur Pendleton, for her murdered husband, Thomas, and for all the nameless victims whose stolen lives were represented by the bonds hidden in the clock. When she reached the tower, it did not seem like a tomb. It looked like a fortress, a silent, stone guardian of the truth she now had to retrieve. She gave the secret knock they had agreed upon, and a moment later, she heard the wooden bar being lifted. The door creaked open, and Leo pulled her inside, his face etched with worry. "You were gone so long," he said. "I was so scared." She quickly explained everything. Abel, the confirmation of their fears, the journalist Tom, the plan. As she spoke, she saw the fear in Leo's eyes slowly being replaced by the same grim resolve she felt. He was no longer just a scared boy. He understood the stakes. He was his father's son. While she talked, she went to the hollow barrel and pulled out the heavy tin box. She held it in her hands, its weight a tangible measure of the danger and the hope it contained. Just as she was about to secure the lid, a new sound cut through the night, a sound that made both of their hearts stop. It was the rumble of a heavy truck engine, laboring up the hill. It wasn't Finch's sleek car. This was something else, something cruder, more violent. The truck's engine cut out, and they were plunged back into a silence that was now thick with menace. A heavy thud, like something being thrown onto the gravel, was followed by the slam of two truck doors. Then, heavy footsteps. Not one person, two. They moved with a brutal confidence, their heavy work boots crunching on the gravel path. Ilara and Leo froze, the tin box resting between them on the floor. Clara shoved it into the shadows behind the mechanism and threw an old dusty canvas over it, her movements frantic. She grabbed Leo and pulled him deeper into the dark forest of gears, her hand clamped over his mouth. They crouched in the absolute darkness, their bodies pressed against the cold, greasy iron of the clock. The only sound was the frantic, panicked drumming of their own hearts and the approaching footsteps. A heavy, violent pounding began on the main door downstairs, a sound that vibrated up through the stone. It wasn't a knock. It was an assault. "Coleman!" a rough voice shouted, the sound muffled but full of gravelly menace. "We know you're in there. Finch is done playing nice." Ilara squeezed her eyes shut, praying they would leave a foolish, childish prayer. The pounding stopped. For a terrifying moment, there was silence. Then came a new sound, the sound of a crowbar being jammed into the wood of the door, followed by a loud, splintering crack. They were breaking in. Ilara's blood ran cold. She pulled Leo tighter against her, shielding him with her own body. The door burst open with a final, groaning crash. Heavy footsteps entered the base of the tower and began to ascend the spiral staircase, their cadence slow, deliberate, and full of terrifying promise. They weren't rushing. They were enjoying the fear they were creating. Ilara could hear their low, gruff voices, the words indistinct but the tone full of cruel amusement. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, a weapon, anything. But there was nothing. They were trapped at the top of the tower, a rat in a cage with the wolves climbing the walls. The smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies began to drift up the staircase, a foul harbinger of the violence to come. The two men stepped into the room. They were large, hulking shapes against the faint light from the broken windows, their features obscured by shadow. One of them held a powerful flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, sweeping across the room and finally landing on Ilara and Leo, pinning them in its harsh white glare. They flinched back, blinded. "Well, well, look what we have here," the man with the flashlight sneered. His partner, a shorter, thicker man, was carrying two large gasoline cans. He set them down with a heavy thud. "Mr. Finch is a very impatient man," the first thug said, taking a step closer. "He gave you a choice. You made the wrong one. So now, there's a new choice. You and the boy are going to walk out of here right now with nothing, or you're going to stay, and we're going to burn this shithole to the ground with you in it." The threat was delivered with a flat, casual brutality that made Ilara's stomach clench with terror. To underscore the point, the second man unscrewed the cap from one of the gasoline cans. The sharp, chemical stench immediately filled the room, overpowering the smells of dust and decay. It was the smell of immolation. He began to splash the liquid onto the old dry wooden floorboards of the spiral staircase landing. The dark liquid soaked into the wood instantly, the fumes making Ilara's eyes water. "The boss wants to be sure you understand," the man said, his voice a low growl. "This whole tower is a tinderbox. It'll go up in seconds. So, what's it gonna be? You walking out, or you staying for the bonfire?" They were trapped. If they walked out, Finch would have them killed on the road. If they stayed, they would be burned alive. It was a choice between two death sentences. Panic, cold and absolute, threatened to shatter Ilara's resolve. Her eyes darted around the dark room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Her gaze fell upon the silent, monstrous clock. In that moment of pure desperation, her mind flashed to the phone call with Abel. He wasn't just a historian, he was a watchmaker. He knew this machine. Her hand fumbled in her pocket for the small, cheap cell phone she had bought with the last of her $87. Her fingers were numb and clumsy with fear, but she managed to dial his number. Keeping the phone low, shielded by her body, she prayed he would answer. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, Abel's dry, reedy voice answered. "Ilara," he whispered, his own voice tight with anxiety. The thugs were laughing, enjoying her terror. "They're here," she breathed into the phone, her voice barely a whisper. "They have gasoline. They're going to burn the tower." A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Listen to me, Ilara." Abel's voice was suddenly sharp, urgent. "The striking hammers. To the side of the main gear assembly, there is a large manual release crank. It's for maintenance. Do you see it?" Her eyes darted to the spot he indicated, a part of the mechanism she had never paid attention to. In the dim light, she saw it. A long, heavy iron crank handle, connected to a series of levers that led up toward the darkness of the belfry where the gigantic bell hung. "I see it," she whispered, her heart pounding. "It will take both of you," Abel's voice commanded from the phone. "It's heavy, but if you can turn it, it will release the hammers from their hold. It will bypass the clockwork and strike the bell. Do it, Ilara. Now, make the clock sing." The thugs had their backs to them, splashing more gasoline. It was their only chance. "Leo," she hissed, her voice a tight coil of pure adrenaline. "The crank. We have to turn the crank. Now." She didn't have to explain. He saw the grim determination on her face and understood. They scrambled over to the mechanism, their movements silent and desperate in the shadows. They each gripped one side of the heavy iron handle, their hands cold and sweaty. They pushed. At first, it didn't budge. It was frozen, seized by decades of rust and disuse. The thugs were turning back, one of them pulling a lighter from his pocket. "Push!" Ilara grunted, putting every ounce of her weight, her fear, and her rage into the effort. With a deafening groan of tortured, protesting metal that echoed through the room, the crank began to move. It was agonizingly slow, inch by painful inch. Then they heard it. A series of loud, mechanical clacks from high above them in the belfry. As the massive gears of the striking mechanism were forced to engage, the second thug paused, his thumb on the lighter's flint wheel, a confused look on his face. "What was that?" he growled. And then it happened. From the belfry came a sound that Oakhaven had not heard in 40 years. It was not a gentle chime. It was a cataclysmic, deafening bong, a violent explosion of sound that slammed into them with physical force. The entire tower vibrated with the immense, resonant power of the bell. The sound was a physical shockwave, an apocalyptic clangor that ripped through the night. The thugs cried out, clapping their hands over their ears, their faces masks of pain and confusion. Ilara and Leo kept pushing, and the bell struck again. Bong. A frantic, insane alarm bell, tolling a warning across the sleeping town. Lights began to flick on in the houses far below. The thugs, utterly panicked by the impossible noise and the sudden attention, abandoned their plan. They scrambled back down the staircase, their footsteps now a frantic, clumsy retreat. In the chaos, Ilara grabbed the tin box. "Abel, the coal chute!" she yelled into the phone. "At the base of the tower, On the north wall, behind the old furnaces, a voice shouted back. They didn't hesitate. They ran for the stairs, the deafening, triumphant song of the bell echoing behind them, a declaration of war against the silence, a promise of the reckoning to come. They burst through the back door of Abel's shop into the warm, ticking darkness. The sudden silence, punctuated only by the gentle chorus of 100 clocks, was a shocking contrast to the apocalyptic clangor of the bell and their own ragged breathing. Ilara's lungs burned with cold air and exertion. She leaned against the door she had just bolted, her body trembling uncontrollably, not from cold but from the violent adrenaline crash. The heavy tin box slid from her numb fingers and thudded onto the wooden floor. Leo collapsed beside it, his chest heaving. The air in the shop, thick with the smells of warm oil, polished wood and old brass, felt like the first clean breath she had taken in months. It was the scent of safety, of sanctuary. Abel rushed toward them, his ancient face a mask of terror and hope. He looked at the boxes, then at them, and for the first time since she'd met him, a slow, determined smile touched his lips. They were alive. They had the proof. The war had just begun, but they had survived the first, brutal battle. From the safety of Abel's cluttered basement workshop, a subterranean world that smelled of solder flux and ozone, the next phase of the war was launched. The space was a crypt of forgotten timepieces, their disassembled guts laid out on benches like complex silver insects. Abel, his hands steady for the first time all night, sat hunched over an old black rotary phone, its cord coiled like a snake. His voice was a low, urgent murmur, a stark counterpoint to the quiet hum of a dehumidifier in the corner. Ilara could hear the faint, tinny squawk of the journalist, Ben Carter, on the other end, his voice sharp, intelligent, cutting through the static with a series of clipped-eye, precise questions. Ilara clutched the cold tin box to her chest, feeling the hard edges of the diary within. The fear was still a cold stone in her gut, but for the first time, it was overlaid with a fragile, fierce hope. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a witness, and her testimony was about to be sent into the world, carried on invisible wires far beyond Finch's murderous reach. Using her cheap phone, its screen a small and bright rectangle of defiance in the gloom, Ilara began to document the evidence. The process felt methodical, sacred. She photographed each page of Arthur Pendleton's diary, her fingers carefully turning the brittle, yellowed paper. The camera's soft click was a sound of finality, capturing the elegant, desperate script that chronicled a 50-year-old crime. She focused on the damning entries, the general's name, the coerced confession, the list of his associates, and the final, chilling mention of the loose steering. Then came the bonds, fanning them out on the workbench to capture the serial numbers, each one a link in a chain of theft and murder. With a trembling thumb, she sent the images to Ben Carter. Each photo that uploaded, marked by a small swoosh sound, felt like a bullet being fired. The weight of the secret, a burden that had crushed 2 men, was finally being lifted from her shoulders and placed into the hands of a man who forged weapons out of words. 2 days later, the story detonated. It wasn't just a local news item, it was a national firestorm. Ben Carter's article, published on the front page of the capital's most respected online journal, was headlined, "The Oakhaven Conspiracy, a Clockmaker's Diary, a Deadly Secret, and a Family's Corrupt Empire." The piece was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, weaving together the heartbreaking entries from Arthur's diary, the verified bond numbers that traced back to shell corporations owned by Finch's father, and the eerily similar accidents that had claimed the lives of both the clockmaker and, 50 years later, a humble maintenance worker named Thomas Coleman. The narrative was explosive, a tale of generational crime, political corruption and murder. Huddled around the glow of Abel's old computer monitor, Ilara read the article, and tears of pure, unadulterated vindication began to stream down her face, dripping onto the dusty desk. Her husband's name was cleared. He wasn't a fool who died in an accident. He was a hero who had died for the truth. The official response was a force of nature. Within hours of the article's publication, a convoy of sleek, black sedans rolled into Oakhaven. They moved with a quiet, efficient menace that made Finch's local power seem pathetic and provincial. These were federal investigators, untouchable, their faces grim and unreadable. They didn't stop at the local sheriff's office, which Finch had owned for decades. They drove straight past it, a deliberate and public snub. From the dusty window of Abel's shop, Ilara, Leo, and Abel watched as the agents, men and women in crisp suits, stepped out onto the main street. They moved with the confident authority of a higher power, their presence shifting the very atmosphere of the town from one of quiet oppression to stunned, breathless anticipation. The whispers that had once been about Ilara's poverty were now about the imminent fall of a king. The hunters had become the hunted, and the cavalry had finally, truly arrived, not for her, but for him. The arrest itself was brutally simple. Devoid of the drama Finch would have written for himself, the federal agents walked directly into his opulent law office, past a terrified receptionist, and into the inner sanctum where Finch had reigned for 40 years. Through the large plate-glass window, the whole town could see it. Alistair Finch rose from his mahogany desk, his face a mask of apoplectic disbelief. There was no shouting, no grand confrontation, just the quiet, methodical presentation of a warrant. Then, the glint of steel. The agents turned Finch around and cuffed his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place was a sound of absolute finality, a sound that echoed louder than the great bell of the clock tower. As they led him out, his handsome face was contorted in a snarl of impotent rage. Ilara watched, her hand gripping Leo's shoulder, and felt the 50-year-old knot of fear that had lived in the heart of Oakhaven finally, irrevocably, come undone. The legal proceedings were a lengthy, complex affair, but the outcome was never in doubt. The clockmaker's diary was the voice from the grave, and Abel's tearful first-hand testimony was its validation. The trail of the bearer bonds, expertly traced by federal accountants, linked Alistair Finch not only to his father's historical crimes, but to a modern network of money laundering and bribery, including the conspiracy to murder Thomas Coleman. The bonds themselves were seized, but the story of Ilara, the destitute widow who brought down an empire, captured the nation's heart. A federal judge, citing her bravery and her husband's sacrifice, awarded her not only the full finder's fee for the recovered assets, but a massive wrongful death settlement from Finch's frozen estate. Her pro bono human rights lawyer told her the final sum over the phone. Ilara heard the number, but her mind couldn't grasp it. It wasn't money. It was a new world. It was safety. It was the future her husband had died trying to secure for them. Ilara stood in a bright, sun-drenched kitchen, the air filled with the warm, yeasty scent of baking bread. A gentle breeze, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass, drifted through an open window. There was no musty stench of decay, no damp chill seeping from the walls. She watched as Leo, now 17, laughed in the lush green yard, his shoulders broad and relaxed, no longer burdened by a weight that was never his to carry. With a fraction of the settlement, she had bought a modest, comfortable home, a world away from the tower's Gothic shadow. She ran her hand over the cool, silent metal of her sewing machine, which sat in a dedicated room filled with light and colorful fabrics. She switched it on, and its gentle, rhythmic hum filled the quiet house. It was no longer a heavy monument to a useless skill, but a tool of creation and joy, stitching together the pieces of a life that was finally, blessedly, whole and peaceful. Her heart, once a frantic drum of fear, now beat with a slow, steady rhythm of profound contentment. That evening, she set the dining room table, not with chipped plates on a dusty floor, but with new porcelain on a polished oak table. She brought out a roast chicken, its skin a perfect crisp gold, surrounded by vibrant vegetables. It was a feast. Leo ate with the unrestrained joy of a boy who no longer knew the gnawing ache of hunger. Ilara watched him, a quiet smile on her face. The $87 that had once represented the sum total of her existence wouldn't have even covered the cost of this single, glorious meal. After dinner, she sat at her desk, not to count her last remaining coins, but to write a check. It was a large sum, made out to the newly established Oakhaven Clock Tower Restoration and Victims Memorial Trust. The tower, once a symbol of her utter despair, would be transformed. Its great clock would be repaired, its bell set to ring on the hour chew, a monument not to a secret but to the triumph of the truth. Elara's journey from the cold floor of a ruined tower to a life of quiet dignity was about more than finding a fortune. It was about the relentless pursuit of truth. She gave a voice to the ghosts of the past and, in doing so, reclaimed a future for her son, proving that the courage of one person can indeed dismantle an empire built on lies. Her story is a testament to the fact that justice, no matter how long it is buried, can and will be brought into the light. What is the true price of silence, and how far would you go to make things right? For more incredible stories of hidden truths and the resilient people who uncover them, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss the secrets we unearth next.